This video is about the fundamentals of film photography. I'll be using the Olympus OM-1 and Olympus OM system lenses, but the principles are the same for all cameras, regardless of the brand. I'm going to be covering a lot of information in this video. Let it soak in, or go back and listen to a section again for you to understand it completely. I'm not going to discuss instant photography. That may be the topic of a future video. Let's go back to ancient history, say before 1990. Most pictures were taken on mechanical cameras. Yes, there might have been some electronics in some of them, but for the most part they were mechanical devices with actual moving parts. Cameras recorded images on a material called photographic film. I'll just call it film. The different kinds of film and how to turn film into pictures may be the subject of a future video. Think of film as a thin, flexible plastic strip with a photosensitive material on one side. Some kinds of film have small holes called sprocket holes that are used by the film transport system to advance the film smoothly within the camera. There were many sizes or formats of film, and it was usually sold by the roll or in sheets, depending on the kind of camera. Film is still available today, but the selection is much more limited, and black and white film is considered a specialty item and is priced accordingly. This roll of Ilford black and white film cost about $25 from Amazon. In the mid-1970s, I remember paying about $1 a roll, tax in. After loading a film camera, you would have between 12 and 36 pictures, called exposures, before having to unload the roll and put in another one. Having so few pictures meant you couldn't shoot pictures of everything. You had to be selective. Film is quite picky about how much light it wants, otherwise pictures are too dark and muddy, or too light and washed out. Well then, how much light is just right? That depends on the film, or more specifically, the film's light sensitivity. Unfortunately, film with high sensitivity produces grainier pictures than film with low sensitivity. It depends on the effect that you want. Even today's cell phone cameras struggle when there's not enough light, producing inferior, grainier images. Except in digital photography, we call it noise. Light sensitivity of a film is given as a number, with higher numbers being more sensitive. There are three common systems: ASA, DIN, and ISO. I find ASA is used most often, and I've circled the ASA number on these boxes. But here's a conversion chart. For example, an ASA 100 film could also be labeled a DIN 21 film or an ISO 100/21 film. Except, we don't talk directly about the sensitivity of film to light. We talk about its film speed. To recap, a high-speed film is one that is very photosensitive and will produce grainy images, compared to a low-speed film, which is less photosensitive and produces smoother images. And of course, there's medium-speed film, which is a compromise. There are two factors that determine how much light hits the film: shutter speed and aperture. Shutter speed is how long the film is exposed to light, usually a 60th of a second or shorter. It's called shutter speed because a mechanism that opens and closes to let light in is called a shutter. The faster the shutter speed, or shorter the exposure, the less light that exposes the film. Not all shutters open and close a hole, but that may be the topic of another video. The shutter speed ring on an OM1 is on the body concentric with the lens mount. The shutter speeds on cameras are arranged so that each setting is double the exposure time compared to the shutter speed next to it. This is hugely important, as you'll see later. Aperture is the light gathering ability of a lens, related to the size of the lens. A bigger lens will generally admit more light. No, that's not true, but let's go with it for now. The light gathering ability of a lens is given as a number called an F number. A lower number will let in more light than a higher F number. Fortunately, if you have a bag of different lenses, all of them say f4, they will all emit the same amount of light, even if they are of different manufacturers and different sizes. Or, to put it another way, F number determines the amount of light through a lens. An f1.4 lens may be adjustable from f1.4, which uses the entire lens area, all the way down to f22, which only uses a tiny fraction of the lens area to admit light. The diaphragm is adjusted by a ring called an f-stop ring or aperture ring somewhere on or near the lens. The rubberized ring below is turned to adjust the focus. The f-stops on cameras are arranged so that each setting lets in half the amount of light compared to the f-stop next to it. This may sound familiar to something I said earlier about shutter speeds. No coincidence. This is hugely important, as you'll see later. There are many different kinds of cameras. I'm just going to focus on one kind of camera, the single lens reflex, or SLR camera. As you may have guessed, a single lens reflex has only a single lens. This lens can usually be removed and replaced with another that might be more suitable for a specific purpose. This makes the SLR a very versatile camera to use. A reflex camera is one that allows the photographer to view the image through the same lens that they will be taking the picture. On reflex cameras, the viewfinder gives a very accurate idea of what you'll get on the film. Not so much with non-reflex cameras. The way a single lens reflex works is by using a mirror to send the image to the viewfinder, but then when the picture is being taken, pivoting the mirror out of the way. This gives SLRs a distinctive sound. The disadvantage of a pivoting mirror is the mechanical complexity that is needed to make this happen quickly and reliably, and with complexity comes cost. For that money, the Olympus OM-1 was a highly reliable camera with a life expectancy of about 400,000 pictures on the shutter. Back in the early days of photography, photographers would use the Sunny 16 rule. This method still works if you don't have a light meter. Find the shutter speed which is nearest the reciprocal of your ASA. Set your aperture to f16 for sunny conditions, f11 for partly cloudy conditions, and so on. As photography became more mainstream and electronics technology improved, manufacturers started putting light meters on and later in cameras. TTL light measurement is so good that most photographers don't bother with the Sunny 16 rule anymore. Keep in mind that the 1.35 volt Mercury PX25 batteries of the 1970s are no longer manufactured. You will have to either modify the meter circuit or use Vine air batteries. They work, but they don't last very long. Set the ASA to the ASA of your film by depressing that small button and turning this to the right ASA. While looking through the viewfinder, with the light meter off or no batteries in the camera, the needle will be sitting at the bottom of its travel. Switch on the meter. Adjust shutter speed and aperture to get the needle in the middle. Make sure that the shutter speed clicks into place. It is not infinitely variable, but the aperture is, so you can place it between f-stops. Let us suppose we set the shutter speed at 1/60th of a second and the aperture at f5.6 to get the needle in the middle between negative and positive. Is that it? Should we just snap the picture and move on? Well, that depends, because there are at least 6 other exposure settings that will work. Recall I mentioned earlier, the shutter speeds are arranged so that each setting is double compared to the shutter speed next to it. And f-stops are arranged so that each setting lets in half the light compared to the f-stop next to it. Drum roll, please. I can get the same exposure by making the shutter speed twice as fast and making the aperture twice as large. Here's another correct exposure. And another. Similarly, you can double the exposure time and halve the amount of light hitting the film. These will all produce correct exposures, but the effects will be slightly different. To sum it up then, if 1/60th at 5.6 is the correct exposure, then all these other settings are also correct exposures, but each will give slightly different effects. You as the photographer get to choose. Shutter speed affects the amount of motion and blur in your pictures, while aperture affects the perspective in the picture. As mentioned earlier, most SLR cameras have interchangeable lenses. How they differ is in their focal length, which is measured in millimeters, and their lens speed, which is another name for f-number. Prime or standard lenses give you close to what you see with unaided eyes. Standards are usually 40 to 60 millimeters, most commonly 50 millimeters. They tend to be fast, that is, with a low f-number. Wide-angle lenses make things look more far away. Wides have a focal length of 28 to 35 millimeters. Ultra-wides or super-wides are 18 to 24 millimeters and make things look very, very far away, also adding distortion. Fisheye lenses have focal lengths between 8 and 16 millimeters and take pictures that look stretched over the surface of a ball. At the other end of the spectrum are telephoto lenses, which bring things closer, like a telescope. Mild telephotos are typically 85 to 100 millimeters, while telephotos start around 200 millimeters and go up to 1,000 millimeters. Zoom lenses have a variable focal length. They tend to be bigger, heavier, and more expensive. I encourage you to acquire a manual film camera like the Olympus OM-1. The limit of 24 or 36 pictures will force you to be selective with your shots, and that will make you a better photographer. That you won't see your photos until the film has been processed makes it very hard to predict what your pictures will look like. The more pictures you take, the better you'll know your equipment. Finally, by setting the camera yourself, rather than trusting your camera to do it, will have you seeing the world through a different lens, literally. It's a wonderful hobby. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. If there's sufficient interest, I can always do a part 2.